In a town in Persia there dwelt two brothers, one named Kasim, the other Ali Baba. Kasim was married to a rich wife and lived in plenty, while Ali Baba had to maintain his wife and children by cutting wood in a neighboring forest and selling it in the town. One day, when Ali Baba was in the forest, he saw a troop of men on horseback coming toward him in a cloud of dust. He was afraid they were robbers and climbed to a tree for safety. When they came up to him and dismounted, he counted 40 of them. They unbridled their horses and tied them to trees. The finest man among them, who Ali Baba took to be their captain, went a little way among some bushes and said, "Open sesame," so plainly that Ali Baba heard him. A door opened in the rocks, and having made the troops go in, he followed them, and the door shut again of itself. They stayed some time inside, and Ali Baba, fearing that they might come out and catch him, was forced to sit patiently in the tree. At last the door opened again, and 40 thieves came out. As the captain went in last, he came out first, and made them all pass by him. He then closed the door, saying, "Shut sesame." Every man bridled his horse and mounted. The captain put himself at the head, and they returned as they came. Then Ali Baba climbed down and went to the door concealed among the bushes and said, "Open sesame," and it flew open. Ali Baba, who expected a dull, dismal place, was greatly surprised to find it a large and well-lighted, hollowed by the hand of man, in the form of a vault, which received the light from an opening in the ceiling. He saw rich bales of merchandise, silk, stuff, brocades all piled together, and gold and silver in heaps, and money in leather purses. He went in, and the door shut behind him. He did not look at the silver, but brought out as many bags of gold as he thought his assess, which were brought outside, he could carry, loaded them with the bags, and hid it with the faggots. Using the word "shut sesame," he closed the door and went home. Then he drove his asses into the yard, shut the gates, carried the money bags to his wife, and emptied them out before her. He bade her keep it the secret, and he would go bury the gold. "Let me first measure it," said his wife. "I will go borrow a measure of someone while you dig the hole." So she ran to the wife of Kasim and borrowed a measure. Knowing Ali Baba's poverty, the sister was curious to find out what sort of grain his wife wished to measure, and artfully planned some suet at the bottom of the measure. Ali Baba's wife went home and set the measure on a heap of gold, and filled it and emptied it often to get her great content. She then carried it back to her sister, without noticing that a piece of gold was sticking to it, which Kasim's wife perceived directly her back was turned. She grew very curious, and said to Kasim when he came home, "Kasim, your brother is richer than you. He does not count his money, he measures it." He begged her to explain this riddle, which she did by showing him the piece of money and telling him where she found it. Then Kasim grew so envious that he could not sleep, and went to his brother in the morning before sunrise. "Ali Baba," he said, showing him the gold piece, "you pretend to be poor, and yet you measure gold." By this Ali Baba perceived that through his wife's folly Kasim and his wife knew their secret, so he confessed all and offered Kasim a share. "That I expect," said Kasim, "but I must know where to find the treasure, otherwise I will discover all, and you will lose all." Ali Baba, more out of kindness than fear, told him of the cave, and the very words to use. Kasim left Ali Baba, meaning to be beforehand with him and get the treasure for himself. He rose early next morning and set out with 10 mules loaded with great chests. He soon found the place and the door in the rock. He said, "Open sesame," and the door opened and shut behind him. He could have feasted his eyes all day on the treasures, but now he hastened to gather together as much of it as possible, but when he was ready to go he could not remember what to say for thinking of his great riches. Instead of sesame, he said, "Open barley," and the door remained fast. He named 7 different sorts of grain, but all but the right one, and the door still stuck fast. He was so frightened at the danger he was in that he had as much forgotten the word as if he had never heard it. At noon the robbers returned to their cave, and saw Kasim's mules roving about with great chests on their backs. This gave them alarm. They drew their sabres, and went to the door, which opened on their captains, saying, "Open sesame." Kasim, who heard the trampling of the horses' feet, resolved to sell his life dearly, so when the door opened he leaped out and threw the captain down. In vain, however, for the robbers with their sabers soon killed him. On entering the cave, they saw all the bags laid ready, and could not imagine how anyone had got in without knowing their secret. They cut Cassim's body into 4 quarters and nailed them up inside the cave in order to frighten anyone who should venture in, and went away in search of more treasure. As night drew on, Cassim's wife grew very uneasy, and ran to her brother-in-law and told him where her husband had gone. Ali Baba did his best to comfort her, and set out to the forest in search of Cassim. The first thing he saw on entering the cave was his dead brother. Full of horror, he put the body on one of his asses, and bags of gold on the other 2, and covering all with some faggots, returned home. He drove the 2 asses laden with gold into his own yard, and led the other to Cassim's house. The door was opened by the slave Morgiana, whom he knew to be both brave and cunning. Unloading the ass, he said to her, "This is the body of your master, who has been murdered, but whom we must bury as though he had died in his bed. I will speak with you again, but now tell your mistress I am come." The wife of Cassim, on learning the fate of her husband, broke out into cries and tears, but Ali Baba offered to take her to live with him and his wife if she would promise to keep her counsel and leave everything to Morgiana, whereupon she agreed, and dried her eyes. Morgiana, meanwhile, sought an apothecary and asked him for some lozenges. "My poor master," she said, "can neither eat nor speak, and no one knows what his distemper is." She carried home the lozenges, and returned next day weeping, and asked for an essence only given to those just about to die. Thus in the evening no one was surprised to hear the wretched shrieks and cries of Cassim's wife and Morgiana, telling everyone that Cassim was dead. The day after, Morgiana went to an old cobbler near the gates of the town, who opened his stall early, put a piece of gold in his hand, and bade him follow her with his needle and thread. Having bound his eyes with a handkerchief, she took him to a room where the body lay, pulled off the bandage, and bade him sew the quarters together, after which she covered his eyes again, but led him home. Then they buried Cassim, and Morgiana, his slave, followed him to the grave, weeping and tearing her hair, while Cassim's wife stayed at home uttering lamentable cries. Next day she went to live with Ali Baba, who gave Cassim's shop to his eldest son. The 40 thieves, on their return to the cave, were much astonished to find Cassim's body gone and some of their money bags. "We are certainly discovered," said the captain, "and shall be undone if we cannot find out who it is that knows our secret. 2 men must have known it. We killed one. We must now find the other. To this end, one of you who is bold and artful must go to the city, dressed as a traveler, and discover whom we have killed, and whether men talk of the strange manner of his death. If the messenger fails, he must lose his life, lest we be betrayed." One of the thieves started up and offered to do this, and after all the rest had commended him for his bravery, he disguised himself, and happened to enter the town at daybreak, just by Baba Mustapha's stall. The thief bade him a good day, saying, "Honest man, how could you possibly see to stitch at your age?" "Old as I am," replied the cobbler, "I have very good eyes, and will you believe me when I tell you I sewed a dead body together in a place where I had less light than I have now." The robber was so overjoyed at his good fortune, and giving him a piece of gold, desired to be shown the house where he stitched up the dead body. At first Mustapha refused, saying that he had been blindfolded, but when the robber gave him another piece of gold, he began to think he might remember the turnings if blindfolded as before. This means succeeded. The robber partly led him, and was partly guided by him, right in front of Cassim's house, the door of which the robber marked with a piece of chalk. Then, well pleased, he bade farewell to Baba Mustapha, and returned to the forest. By and by, Morgiana, going out, saw the mark the robber had made, quickly guessed that some mischief was brewing, and fetched a piece of chalk, marked 2 or 3 doors on each side, without saying anything to her master or mistress. The thief, meantime, told his comrades of his discovery. The captain thanked him, and bade him show him the house he had marked, but when they came to it, they saw there were 5 or 6 of the houses that were chalked in the same manner. The guide was so confounded that he knew not what answer to make, and when they returned, he was at once beheaded for having failed. Another robber was dispatched, and having won over Baba Mustapha, marked the house in red chalk, but Morgiana being again too clever for them, the second messenger was put to death also. The captain now resolved to go himself, but wiser than the others, he did not mark the house, but looked at it so closely that he could not fail to remember it. He returned and ordered his men to go into the neighboring villages and buy 19 mules and 38 leather jars, all empty except one, which was full of oil. The captain put one of his men, fully armed, into each, rubbing the outside of the jars with the oil from the full vessel. Then the 19 mules were loaded with 37 robbers in jars, and the jar of oil, and reached the town by dusk. The captain stopped his mules in front of Ali Baba's house and said to Ali Baba, who was sitting outside for coolness, "I have brought some oil from a distance to sell at tomorrow's market, but it is now so late that I know not where to pass the night, unless you will do me the favor to take me in." Though Ali Baba had seen the captain of the robbers in the forest, he did not recognize him in the disguise of an oil merchant. He bade him welcome, opened his gates for the mules to enter, and went to Morgiana to bid her prepare a bed and supper for his guest. He brought the stranger into his hall, and after they had supped, went again to speak with Morgiana in the kitchen, while the captain went into the yard under pretense of seeing after his mules, but really to tell his men what to do. Beginning at the first jar and ending at the last, he said to each man, "As soon as I throw some stones from the window of the chamber where I lie, cut the jars open with your knives and come out, and I will be with you in a trice." He returned to the house, and Morgiana led him to his chamber. She then told Abdallah, her fellow slave, to set on the pot to make some broth for her master, who had gone to bed. Meanwhile her lamp went out, and she had no more oil in the house. "Do not be uneasy," said Abdallah. "Go into the yard and take some out of one of those jars." Morgiana thanked him for his advice, took the oil pot, and went into the yard. When she came to the first jar, the robber inside said softly, "Is it time?" Any other slave but Morgiana, on finding a man in a jar instead of oil she wanted, would have screamed and made a noise, but she, knowing the danger her master was in, bethought herself of a plan, and answered quietly, "Not yet, but presently." She went to all the jars, giving the same answer till she came to the jar of oil. She saw now that her master, thinking to entertain an oil merchant, had led 38 robbers into his house. She filled her oil pot, went back to the kitchen, and having lit her lamp, went again to the oil jar and filled a large kettle full of oil. When it boiled, she went and poured enough oil into every jar to stifle and kill the robber inside. When this brave deed was done, she went back to the kitchen, put out the fire in the lamp, and waited to see what would happen. In a quarter of an hour, the captain of the robbers awoke, got up, and opened the window. All seemed quiet. He threw down some little pebbles which hit the jars. He listened, and as none of his men seemed to stir, he grew uneasy, and went down into the yard. On going to the first jar and saying, "Are you asleep?" he smelt the hot boiled oil, and knew at once that his plot to murder Ali Baba and his household had been discovered. He found all his gang was dead, and missing the oil out of the last jar, became aware of the manner of their death. He then forced the lock of a door leading into a garden, and climbed over several walls, made his escape. Morgiana heard and saw all this, and, rejoicing at her success, went to bed and fell asleep. At daybreak Ali Baba arose, and seeing the oil jar still there, asked why the merchant had not gone with his mules. Morgiana bade him look into the first jar and see if there was any oil. Seeing a man, he started back in terror. "Have no fear," said Morgiana. "The man cannot harm you, he is dead." Ali Baba, when he had recovered somewhat from his astonishment, asked what had become of the merchant. "Merchant," said she, "he is no more a merchant than I am." And she told him the whole story, assuring him that it was a plot of the robbers in the forest, of whom only 3 were left, and that the white and red chalk marks had something to do with it. Ali Baba at once gave Morgiana her freedom, saying that he owed her his life. They then buried the bodies in Ali Baba's garden, where the mules were sold in the market by his slaves.